Anti-terrorism legislation are laws with the purpose of fighting terrorism. They usually, if not always, follow specific bombings or assassinations. Anti-terrorism legislation usually includes specific amendments allowing the state to bypass its own legislation when fighting terrorism-related crimes, under alleged grounds of necessity. Because of this suspension of regular procedure, such legislation is sometimes criticized as a form of law accelerates which may unjustly repress all kinds of popular protests. Critics often allege that anti-terrorism legislation endangers democracy by creating a state of exception that allows authoritarian style of government. At the end of the 19th century, Russia, Europe and the United States were confronted to a new radical movement which engaged in violent and illegal acts. This movement was first created in Tsarist Russia, where young intellectuals, sometimes staunch positivists, began to engage in a violent struggle against the Tsar. Finding their influence in Nikolai Chernyshevsky's What is to be Done, they began to advocate assassinations and bombings. One of the first group, Zemlyi Volya, Camus would later write a thoroughly thought-out essay on existentialism, rebellion and the use of violence in history in The Rebel, which denounced both quietism and terrorism. Russian nihilists eventually succeeded in assassinating Alexander II in 1881. The nihilist movement then quickly spread to all of Europe, in particular via one of the founder of anarchism, Mikhail Bakunin, who fled to Switzerland, a haven for political refugees of the time. There, he joined the First International, which eventually theorized propaganda of the deed. Starting in the 1880s, a wave of bombings and assassination attempts, organized by people close to the anarchist movement, literally began to terrorize the governing classes. Propaganda of the deed was not necessarily violent action, but often took that form. Spinning on the right of rebellion, which had been theorized centuries ago by liberal thinker John Locke, such anarchists had no moral problems in theorizing regicides and tyrannicides, since it was for the good of the people. Bakunin thus wrote that, we must spread our principles, not with words but with deeds, for this is the most popular, the most potent, and the most irresistible form of propaganda. As soon as 1887, several anarchists opposed themselves to what they saw as a self-defeating tactic, including Peter Kropotkin, who wrote that year in Le Revolte that, it is an illusion to believe that a few kilos of dynamite will be enough to win against the coalition of exploiters. Kropotkin's pragmatism eventually proved to be more realist than the most radical anarchists' idealism. Soon, all the labor movement was confronted to strong repression from the state, which did not manage to convince the people to start an insurrectionary and general strike, as had been expected by the theorists of propaganda of the deed. Furthermore, as depicted in Joseph Conrad's novel, agent provocateurs also infiltrated the movement, permitting many arrests in the social movement. In France, after Auguste Valence's attempt, the opportunist Republicans voted in 1893 the first anti-terrorist laws, which were quickly denounced as law accelerates. These laws severely restricted freedom of expression. The first one condemned apology of any felony or crime as a felony itself, permitting widespread censorship of the press. The second one allowed to condemn any person directly or indirectly involved in a propaganda of the deed act, even if no killing was effectively carried on. The last one condemned any person or newspaper using anarchist propaganda, 1. Either by provocation or by apology, encouraged one or several persons in committing either a stealing, or the crimes of murder, looting or arson, 2. Or has addressed a provocation to military from the army or the navy, in the aim of diverting them from their military duties and the obedience due to their chiefs, will be deferred before courts and punished by a prison sentence of 3 months to 2 years. Thus, free speech and encouraging propaganda of the deed or antimilitarism was severely restricted. Some people were condemned to prison for rejoicing themselves of the 1894 assassination of French President Sadi Carnot by the Italian anarchist Caserio. The trial of the 30 took place in 1894, at the issue of which almost all the defendants were acquitted. The term of low accelerates has since entered popular language to design any harsh or unjust laws. In particular, anti-terrorism legislation which often broadly represses the whole of the social movements. The United Kingdom quickly became the last haven for political refugees. In particular, anarchists, who were all conflated with the few who had engaged in bombings. Already, the first international had been founded in London in 1871, where Karl Marx had taken refuge. But in the 1890s, Th.